So now let's look at some traits of different weeds that we have in the United States. We're going to look at seed production, the dormancy, dispersal, so how that seed is going to move from place to place, vegetative, so that asexual reproduction portion that happens, and then just some biotypes within those weeds. Now let's look at seed production within weeds. So just to compare what those seeds look like within weeds, I'm going to just give you a couple numbers that I think these are in your book, but these just kind of compare and contrast how many seeds are per plant. So they are extremely small. Most of these weed seeds are really small, but that enables them to then become extremely invasive throughout the growing season. So for example, there's over 15,000 seeds in one ragweed grass. So if you're looking at that, that could, if it's not taken care of, be pretty invasive. And so because there are those high levels of seed, it's going to become really rapidly spread throughout the field or the ecosystem. And they can survive under some pretty intense conditions, whether hot or cold. They can definitely survive because there's so many different seeds. Just a couple other ones that are really a nuisance to farmers. Pigweed, like we talked about, they can release over 117,000 seeds, which is crazy, and that makes you wonder how much how much more we're going to have to look into managing these different types of weeds. Weeds have kind of the same type of dormancy that field plants do as well. But the thing about weed seed is they can be dormant for quite some time, for long periods of time, and that will then just let them be able to germinate over different types of conditions, and not necessarily have to have the right conditions like a field crop would. And so we do have two different types of dormancy. We have dormant and non-dormant seeds that will accumulate, and that is what we call a seed bank. So those seed banks will then help provide a reservoir for that seed to then be able to grow and then be able to populate throughout that field or ecosystem, agroecosystem, what have you. So once that happens, then a new population is then been given, and then it just kind of disperses from there, and it's kind of up to that environmental or cultural conditions for it to be appropriately established within that part of the field or ecosystem, whatever it's trying to start growing in. So these are 4 different types of seed dispersals that are very commonly seen. We have a cockerburrow, which I'm sure you all have seen those. So those are spread by you and me. Those are spread by, animal fur, clinging on to different things, whether that's humans, animals, what have you. That's just one type of seed dispersal that doesn't feel very good. Then we have a wild oat. Those can be driven many different ways. Wind, water, animals, kind of the same thing. Milkweed seeds, those are carried by the wind. And then we have that curly dock seed that can float. So it's carried by the water. So vegetative reproduction. So when you think vegetative, think asexual reproduction. And strategies for that. So we have a couple different examples: rhizomes, creeping roots, and stolons. And this is without the use of the seed. So we're not having to use the seed for that vegetative reproduction. It kind of does it on its own because it's asexual. So how do we fix that? Well, tillage is a big one because it's going to cut up those stolons and the rhizomes into different types of pieces and then help regenerate into new plants, if it's not being managed with some sort of herbicide or other type of management system. And that can, then help or hurt your farm. Now let's look at weed biotypes. So these biotype weeds just form and adapt to the environment that it's growing in, or the management practices that farmer has in place. And these can often become herbicide resistant. So the herbicide that you might throw down on your ground might not get rid of these weeds, or just might do a very poor job of it. So it's really important to know the biotypes of the weeds that we have so that we can pick the right type of herbicide, and we're not spending too much money on herbicide that's not working, because that's just it's a tax write-off, but it really hurts your pocketbook and it's going to hurt your yield as well. Now let's look at some programs and some services that the U.S. government has to help us out with the risk of losses due to weeds in our fields and in our production services. So U.S. government and the USDA have formed many services to help farmers and ranchers out with this problem. One big one is the APHIS service, or this is the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service through the USDA, and it helps, it prevents the introduction of different parasitic plants into different parts of the United States, and federal noxious weeds, like we talked about a couple slides ago, that that federal act that came about with noxious weeds. It just helps introduce knowledge and helps introduce different ways to eradicate those invasive and noxious weeds. So that's a really good program, especially for young farmers and ranchers to get involved with, and a good service for them, because it's going to just educate them a little bit more on what's coming up, what new ways to eradicate or get rid of these noxious and other weeds that might pose a problem. State government, kind of the same thing, but the big thing with the state government, federal government really wants you to really align your practices with the U.S. government, the federal government, so that there's a kind of a clearer way of doing things, and not a lot of laws will be broken that way. So that's good. A couple things that farmers can do. The first one is to prevent weed seed production. So really, one of the best things that a producer can do is crop scout at least once a week, so that you see the different types of weeds that might be coming up, and you can take care of that problem very, very quick. Sometimes people will do it 2 to 3 times a week. Some farmers and ranchers won't do it at all throughout their growing season, but we do it about once a week, just so that we're looking to see what's going on in our field, and we can take care of it, so it's not going to minimize our yields. The next one is weed-free seed, which many farmers and ranchers, if they're going to buy seed, that's one thing that they're going to make sure they look for, because that's just that price might be a little bit bigger as far as that bag of seed goes, but you're not going to have to pay the thousands in herbicide that you would if it was not weed-free seed. So herbicides, the whole point of herbicides is to kill weeds. So it's a chemical, many different kinds of herbicides we have to kill weeds. And the primary method, it's a primary method of weed control. It's the most common in agriculture production. We have a couple disadvantages and a couple of advantages. Some advantages, it's extremely effective if you pick the right one, and if you spray the correct herbicide at the correct time, and it can be persistent, so it can last throughout a growing season, reduces the cost of what it might take to get those weeds out of there later in the growing production. But it can kill some other plants that maybe is not the target for that, and can burn some leaves if it's put on too strong. Contamination's a big worry, and then herbicide resistance, which we've talked a little bit about, and we'll go into a little bit more depth this week in class. Herbicides are very, very widely used on corn, potatoes, and other crops that we have in the United States, just to lessen that farmers' ease of mind. It's going to that farmer's going to be able to kind of take care of a couple things at one time. It might cost them a little bit in the short term, but the long term, that yield's going to be a little bit higher, and it's going to help out with the overall production. So this is a graph. It's also in your book, but this is just the amount of pesticides that we used in the United States from 1964 to 2004, and you can see that herbicides are the largest group of those pesticides, because we're able to throw them down a little bit easier and a little bit more cost effectively, and we're able to see the yield increase more than in insecticides and fungicides. So now let's look at herbicide tolerant crops. So this is just those crops that are designed to tolerate specific broad spectrum herbicides. So those herbicides that will kill the surrounding weeds, but then leave the corn, soybeans, or cotton okay. And these are also Roundup Ready crops as well. So this can be used whether we're looking at a conservation or a no-till system as well. And this is very widely used around all of the whole United States. Now, I'm sure you've heard of some controversy regarding glyphosate, and we'll talk more about that in class this week. So this is a just a graph that'll show you the adoption of genetically engineered crops in the United States. So you can see soybeans, cotton, and corn, and we're looking from 1996 to 2010. And when we're looking at that, that graph, you can see that soybeans have in the percentage of acres have went up tremendously since 1999. So corn had a gradual lift there in the early 2000s, but it's starting to become pretty close to soybeans.